ask me, what is the Sterling Society? I'm Johanna Guzik, and I'm the president of the Sterling Society, and we have many of our board members here and other members of the Sterling Society. We are a group who bring people to the Arts Center. We have fundraisers, and the results of these fundraisers are the chairs you're sitting on, the tables you're using, and the addition of this building. We donated $20,000 toward this building. Thank you. We funded the renovation of the children's hands-on area every year. Todd Still, who is around here, the one fellow you see, Todd takes care of redoing that area with a new theme every year. There's Todd. So we paid for that. So that's why we have fundraisers. We bring in wonderful people like you to come and hear wonderful speakers like we're going to have tonight. And at the same time, we raise a few pennies. So we're just delighted to have you here. If you've got everything you need, I'm going to introduce Dee in just a minute. Some of the activities that we have at the Sterling Society is every second Thursday of the month, we have coffee and conversation with the artist. And I see in the audience that we have Tara Aiken here, and she was one of our speakers for our coffee and conversation. Any others that I have forgotten that you spoke for us? I don't see any here. But it's free, it's open for everyone to come to, and we many times have 50 to 60 people for these lectures that come on noon time, and it goes to 1 o'clock on the second Thursday of the month. And I always tell everybody, don't find out who the artist is, just come, they're all fantastic. Another thing that we are doing as a fundraiser is, well, more of a friend-raiser, is our holiday cookie exchange. If any of you have ever been there, we have homemade cookies. You bring 3 to 4 dozen cookies, and you eat as many cookies as you can from the variety that are there. And then we give you a baggie of cookies to take home with you. And there are a variety of cookies that are included with that. Along with the cookie exchange, we always have some musical entertainment. And this year we are going to have a cantor who sings all kinds of holiday music, not just Jewish holiday music, but she will sing all, and she has a fantastic voice. We have Alan Arnold, who used to have Arnold's Floral. He will come and make wreaths for us or door hangings, and he will do a little demonstration of how he does them, and then we auction them off. They're absolutely beautiful. So there's a lot to do at our cookie exchange besides eating all those wonderful cookies. But now I'm going to tell you about Dee Kilgo. She has a PhD and is an emeritus professor of art history at Illinois State University. A frequent museum lecturer, her teachings and research specialties are 19th century European and American painting and the history of photography. Among her professional accomplishments are 2 published books, a PBS documentary, and research grants from the Smithsonian, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Missouri History Museum. She and her husband, Bob, have recently moved to Dunedin. Dee has attended our Coffee and Conversation series, where she learned about our program on Africa, which was presented by Ronnie and John Stewart. And as a result of that, she wanted to do something similar about James McNeill Whistler at the Dunedin Fine Arts Center. She chose Whistler because he is one of the most colorful and controversial figures in Victorian England. His reputation as an eccentric dandy and a razor-sharp wit long overshadowed his extraordinary innovations as a printmaker. She hopes there's enough interest in art history that she could attract a group to a series of lectures she's planning, and she'll tell you about that later. So let's welcome Dee to tell us about James Whistler.
Since I was just out of the street trying to wave my husband down with the cord to my laptop. This may take a moment to get my.
Can you get near the microphone, please?
Pardon?
Can you use the
I'm
microphone?
going to. I'm just chatting now. Right. Is that going to be good?
Yeah.
Okay. And Joanna, I need the other lights out, please. Joanna didn't mention, I guess you forgot, but the south one is the one we used on the bottom.
Okay.
Oh my gosh. I should have had my lifestyle lift. a little more blame. You forgot to tell them that I was a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader until last year. Okay, let's see if this is going to work now. Oh, along here. All right. Oh, you're doing the little trivia? This is a prize for Joanna too, because I brought two special prizes, and the first one is a small jar of pickled baby eel, and that was the favorite snack of Queen Victoria. And then we have an original paparazzi photo of Prince Harry nude. You better work on your answers. The only thing I was concerned about tonight was all of you drinking and carrying on for a while before the presentation starts. Was that I might look out, you'll all be doing that. And I do have some handouts. Isn't it cute? I do have some handouts. I'll tell you a little bit about the presentation for next year. What I want to do tonight is to give you a glimpse into Whistler and his amazing kind of dual character. He is this, lively, dandy kind of public person, and he has a very, very different personality as an artist. And I'm going to just go through a few of his portraits. The number of portraits available, I think, are kind of an indication of the sort of level of celebrity of a person, and there are just millions of portraits out there of James Whistler. For half a century after his death, he died in 1903, his unique achievements were overshadowed for such a long time by this reputation as a wit and a dandy. And so many people remember him only because of the painting of his mother, or because of the big feud that he had with Oscar Wilde. But there was also, in 1989, a retrospective show, and I was so taken by the description of him as an aesthetic kamikaze. That is what really is going to be the theme of my talk tonight. So I'm going to go on here and just show you a few of these wonderful portraits. Whistler was born in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1834, although he typically said that he'd been born in St. Petersburg, Russia. He spent part of his youth there, however, in Russia, where his father, George Washington Whistler, was a railroad engineer working for the Czar. And it was in Russia while the family lived in the royal palace that Whistler first showed his extraordinary talent for drawing. Back in the States, James honored, reluctantly, the Whistler family tradition by going off to West Point, where he excelled in drawing, but not so much in chemistry. And after 3 years of being unable to pass chemistry, they booted him out. In addition, he had set the school record for the number of demerits accrued by a single student. And when he still referred to himself through his life as a West Point man. And he made the comment often when people would mention it, he would say that if silicon had been a gas, I would have been a famous general. So after being escorted off the campus, and after much hand-wringing by his mom, his father had passed away in Russia, Jimmy left for Paris in 1855 with the plan to drink wine, meet girls, and study art in that order. Now, before I continue, this is a picture of him. He's about 8 years old there. Before I continue with the story, I'm going to digress just briefly to tell you a bit about the art scene that he would have encountered in Paris when he arrived in 1855. And as you can very sweeping generalizations, will probably be arrested by the art history sheriff, but nevertheless. The most important event of the year there in Paris is illustrated in this print. And the most important event is the Salon. It was an annual spring exhibition, a government-sponsored event that had been going on for more than a century. And it was open to the public for weeks. And in the days before Kindles and MTV and all that, the Salon provided a very important popular source of entertainment for middle and upper class Parisians and tourists. By the mid-century, 19th century, Salon exhibits displayed 2,000 to 3,000 works, hung floor to ceiling and room after room. You can see this is an earlier, but it gives you an idea of the immensity of these experiences.
That's like our student members show.
The thing that makes this very important, the Salon exhibit, is because it was really, seriously, the only show in town. There was no alternative for artists who wanted to display their works. You can't hear? Okay. Is that better? I'll just stick with it. I'll stay closer. Would you raise your hand? If you, I can hardly see. Raise your hand or throw something soft. The situation is this: at that time, there were no private commercial galleries. There were a few, I should say, but they only handled the work of dead artists, so that wasn't a very good option. And it was the only stairway to the stars for young artists, because it was the only way to get exposure, to get commissions, to get recognized. Now, by 1850, this is an 1850 print, and it pictures the reject storage hall following the jury selection. And if there were 2,000 works accepted for the Salon exhibit, there would be at least 3,000 who would be rejected. And I call this the art hospice. Now, for Salon jurors, the yay or nay decision on a work typically boiled down to just two factors. One was the subject matter, and the second would be the technique. And so I brought along, I don't like any of these works, but I thought maybe I'd just very quickly talk briefly about what was expected and what sort of separated the talented artist from the superstar. And we're talking here about this long tradition. The Academy and the Salon have been operating for more than 200 years. And the Academy also ran the École des Beaux-Arts where they set the rules for what good art should look like, and their curriculum was based on all of those features. This is a much earlier painting, but I wanted to just make the point that there was a very rigid, long-established hierarchy for subject matter. And the most important and revered kind of painting for all of these several centuries was history painting. Because the one important thing that separated the average artist from the superstar was that art in the classical academic tradition had to be inspiring. It had to have a moral, uplifting response. And this is, so within history painting, there would be scenes from mythology, scenes from the Bible, let's see, allegories, and then it's like, noble events from history. This is a painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps, and he actually was on a little brown mule. That's the kind of thing you knew that you had to do, because the artists, the great artists, were always to improve and to never just look at nature. This is an allegory. This is heavenly love and earthly love. We have this hierarchy now. We've got the history paintings are way up here, and then you drop all the way down to genre, that is scenes of everyday life, and portraiture, and then way at the bottom would be still life, the lowest of the low, because it was imitation. It didn't take any imagination. There was nothing inspiring about it. It had no great moral message, and so forth. This is a typical genre, because they were most acceptable and appealing if they dealt with family values. Now, at this time, there's also a new interest in other cultures. And I just brought a couple of these to show you. First of all, because they also are wonderful examples of the kind of technique. And in academy and the école, the technique for classicism and the academic standards is very highly polished, no visible brush strokes, and like a hard, solid, sort of enamel kind of surface, and minute detail. And of course, Venuses abound, because any theme from mythology or any theme that related in one way or another to antiquity or to the masters of the Renaissance were very, very popular. And these were, of course, this is a great cartoon. This is by Jovier. And it is amazing when you look at the catalogs how many Venuses are there, and of course they are totally pure. But I brought this along because I'm about to introduce you to Gustave Pervade, who rattled the cage of the Academy and the Salon really seriously by introducing a movement called realism. And this is the kind of woman that he painted. And when he had a work of nude in the Salon for reasons that he had been in previously, and so it was accepted, Napoleon III was so revolted that he hit it with his riding whip, supposedly. because if you look at these nude Venuses, they don't look like women, they look like statues. I mean, they have no cellulite, they have no body hair, they're perfect, smooth, polished body. So that's Mr. Pervade, and you're going to meet him very shortly. This one is just like, this epitomizes the whole thing. This is a painting by probably the top medal winner in the Salon in the 1840s and 50s, Paul Delaroche. And this is a 20-foot painting that became then part of an 88-foot panel. There are three works altogether. This is the center one, and it has all the painters from history. There's Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael and Andy Warhol. I mean, they're all there. And this is the centerpiece. And I'm trying to remember now, because I didn't pay much attention to these. It was a last-minute idea. But this is the center, and they're elevated because these are the three artists involved in building the Pantheon. The Parthenon, I'm sorry. So it would be Phidias, Apelles, and let's see, Ignatus, I think. But that reverence and just adoration for antiquity. But this one, it was also something I want to show you in regard to just the kind of the sharp detail, that all over sharper focus. You smooth out, you polish away any visible brushstrokes for what they call finish. And then the obligatory nude ladies are the muses, the protectors of the arts. And there's always one, you know, like losing her beach towel over there. So, those were the rules and regulations. I mean, those were the expectations in terms of how we made the painting, its execution, and the kinds of subjects. And the man you're looking at here is Gustave Pervade, and he's one of the first artists to ever openly attempt to challenge the stranglehold power of the academy system. And this shocking public challenge, again, was the effort of this man. He was a Frenchman, he was a bomb thrower, he was a socialist, he was quite a colorful character. He made many, many, many self-portraits. This is an earlier one. And when Whistler came in 1855, Pervade looked like this. They had opened McDonald's, I think, in Paris by that time. Anyway, Courbet named and launched the first anti-academy movement that he called realism. Now that's realism with an R. And when his paintings were rejected from the 1855 Salon in Paris, he took the unprecedented and audacious measure of renting a space and holding his own exhibit, which ran concurrently with the big salon that year. And he called his show the Pavilion of Realism. And he handed out a brochure and explained what the terms meant and all about his theories. And here's a demonstration of his realist theories in one of the works from that historic show, which was lost in World War II, which you can see called The Stonebreakers. In Courbet's words, painting must only represent real and existing things. And practicing what he preached, in that regard, he hired two card-carrying street laborers that he had seen one day to come into his studio wearing their regular clothes and painted the scene. And here's what he said that the idea is that the artist must paint from the here and now, not from the imagination, but from direct observation. So from the works that you saw previously, you can see that that's a major departure and quite shocking to conservative circles. Now, equally shocking here is the fact that he's got these low-life characters pictured on a canvas. It's about 5.5 by 8 feet, which is a size that had always been reserved for heroic subjects. In academic art, big canvases were reserved for big ideas and important people. By conservative standards, Courbet's technique was as ugly and disgusting as his workers. His brush strokes are rough, the surface is crusty, and some shapes are even laid on with a palette knife. Whoa. Yeah, that's what I want. Courbet was the talk of the town when 21-year-old Jimmy Lisser arrives there in 1855, and that's about the time that he did this self-portrait. Can you hear me okay now back there? No?
No.
You can't hear me?
No.
Oh. Well, try this. Can you hear? No. Am I yelling? Okay. James' first task when he gets to Paris is to sign up for classes at one of the many independent studios there that would offer like live drawing and an occasional critique by an established artist. But all reports say that after he signed up, he really never bothered to go. Instead, he spent most of his time studying and copying paintings in the galleries of the Louvre, which was an obligatory experience for art students in Paris. That's why they went to Paris so often. Now, when Whistler wasn't in the Louvre, he was hanging out in the bars where Courbet routinely held court, espousing his realist theories. Whistler felt an immediate kinship with Courbet and with his theories, and also with the young artists who were becoming Courbet followers. And among that group, his best pals are Edgar Degas, the Impressionists who did the beautiful ballerinas a decade later, and also Claude Monet. And Whistler and Monet were good buddies, actually, for his whole life. This is the most interesting and informative document about his student life that I was able to find. It was actually done at the drawing many years later from memory by a fellow student there in Paris, a Frenchman. And the more normal-looking guy on the right is Edward Poynter, who was a British art student there at the same time with Whistler. And Whistler couldn't stand him because he was just like too British. What this portrait illustrates so well is that very early on in this time in Paris, Whistler concluded that the artist's looks and demeanor could be in themselves a work of art. And he acted on that idea, as you probably know, throughout his entire adult life by creating that flamboyant, dandyish persona that distinguished him, his public image. As you see here, his hallmark appearance included a head of wild curly hair, a wide-brimmed straw hat decorated with ribbons that just made the French crazy. They thought it was the most horrible fashion faux pas that they had ever seen. Then there was always crisp, impeccable white linen suit that he wore in warm weather. And he always wore these really thin, black patent dancing shoes with pink ribbons. And many of the demerits that he got at West Point was because he wouldn't wear the boots. He insisted on wearing his own fancy shoes. He also carried an extra long cane so that he could have extra dramatic gestures. At this time, he had not yet, to go back there, he had not yet begun to wear the signature monocle, nor had he yet gotten his, distinctive white forelock that came in his late 30s. By the way, he had very poor eyesight. From all reports, Whistler's behavior was as outrageous as his appearance. He was a natural-born entertainer. Today you would probably call him a one-man Saturday Night Live, or like a little skinny Robin Williams on steroids. His biographies abound with stories about him being in a cafe without warning, jumping on the table, singing in English, like minstrel songs, and then like seamlessly going into quoting Shakespeare, and then on singing in French. There's amazing imitations that he could do of the popular cabaret singers. And if his wild side got him lots of attention, he also got attention there in the avant-garde group of artists for his skills in etching. And I don't have time, it's almost a criminal that I'm not going to be able to talk about his printmaking, but I did want to show you a couple, because this is one way he made extra money. He was always broke, and he was able to whip off a few etchings. He had a deal with a Paris print shop This is his mistress at that time, Flumet. She was a can-can dancer there. And I brought this other one, which is more characteristic. This is his niece, Annie. And at this time, again, I'm not going to spend time on it, but the idea of not making these just little tiny, very detailed, very naturalistic, realistic scenes, which are mostly just reproductions and etchings. These were so expressive in a way that you don't see really almost since Rembrandt. After 4 years in Paris, he's 25 years old. He finally sets to work on his first major painting, a work done specifically to submit to the Paris Salon. Tradition now that indicates that you're kind of at this formal, announcement that you're at the end of your student life. This is titled At the Piano. It's a 2 by 3 foot painting picturing his older stepsister, Deborah Hayden, and her daughter. And they're in the music room of their very lovely home in London. She was married to Dr. Hayden, and Whistler went to visit them quite often. So he submits his work, and much to his surprise, the jury was not impressed. That rejection, which he did not take kindly, may have prompted his decision to try his luck on the other side of the channel. So in the summer of 1859, Whistler heads for London, where he moved into the Hayden's plush townhouse, and the move made a lot of sense from a couple of perspectives. He would have a more comfy lifestyle. He had made previous trips there, so he had some potential clients for his etchings. And one can assume also that he hoped that the juries at the Royal Academy salons would be less rigorous. Here's one of the works that he did as soon as he got there. In addition, he was really eager to try his hand at picturing the Thames River, which had fascinated him since he was a little kid the very first time that he had visited London. And he also was eager to make some money. So to that end, he began this now famous series known as the Thames set. And this is one of the first of the Black Lion Wharf, and one of the most famous best-selling from that series. And I won't go into it, but these are ordinary characters. Black Lion Wharf was a kind of a rough section on the river. So he's very much now sort of exploring the ideas that he got from Pervade. Whistler was encouraged by the positive response to his etchings, and so because of that, he decided to try his luck in the new venue by submitting at the piano to the jury of the London Royal Academy annual exhibit, which was the counterpart, except much, much smaller, to the Paris Salon. And much to his delight, the painting was not only accepted, but it sold like that. That was the first time it actually sold a major painting. Now that doesn't mean that this was universally admired. One critic, a respected critic, wrote this description of Whistler's entry here. Mr. Whistler's entry is an eccentric, uncouth, smudgy, phantom-like picture of a lady at a pianoforte with a ghostly-looking child in a white frock looking on. Other critics, several, all suggested that there was something strange about the oddly detached mood. Now, Whistler's paintings undoubtedly looked out of place when you compare them to the exhibit's most widely admired pictures, like this one titled No Walk Today. Well, there were some history paintings, typically at the Royal Academy exhibits. Victorian sentimentality ruled the day in English art. And this is a wonderful example, and it always offers, these kind of paintings would offer the viewer, to imagine the backstory here. Why is she not getting her walk, and to identify, with the feelings of the person pictured. Whistler loathed this kind of painting, saying that British viewers confused painting with literature. They didn't know the difference. And when he was ill in his later years, he attributed his declining health to having had too much exposure to British art. The first paintings that Whistler did when he got to London were river scenes that all clearly reflect Courbet's influence. And among that series from the early 60s is this one called Wapping on the Thames. At almost 4 foot wide, this was the largest and most ambitious effort for him as a realist painter. And Wapping was a notoriously rough dock area in East London. And in addition to the obvious realist features, that is the working class characters, the minimal detail, somber palette, and so forth, he had followed Courbet's dictum to paint out of doors. So this entire thing, he said en plein air, was his effort to do that, and he almost went crazy, and it took him a couple of years actually to finish this. Every day was a struggle. By the way, the redhead is his new model, the Irish girl, Jo Heffernan. You'll see her again. When he finally finished this painting, he also was finished with plein air painting. He said, that's it, no more of that for me. So this painting, Wapping, marks a turning point in Whistler's career. His affair with Courbet was over. Every time I see this, I think of the student who said to me, Wapping, isn't that like bowling? This is titled Symphony and White, #1, The White Girl. But when it was first shown in London, it was simply called The White Girl, Woman in White, I think. It was done in 1862. It's almost life-size. It's in the National Gallery in Washington. You're probably not familiar with this painting, but in Whistler's own time, this was the work, not Portrait of Mom, that made him a really major player in avant-garde circles, both in London and in Paris. And it also gave him his first taste of controversy, which he loved. So once again, this is Joanna, his model, and by this time she was his live-in mistress and housekeeper. Whistler became really attached to her, once describing her as, quote, my Irish hellcat with skin like milk, quick-witted for a woman, thanks Jimmy, with a soul as deep as a well. In 1862, when Whistler submitted this for the Royal Academy exhibit, even his new important friends on the jury would not step up to the plate for him on this one. It was unanimously rejected. And as I said, at that time it was called The Woman in White. Now, a few months later, it was shown in a group exhibit at a new commercial private gallery that had opened in London called the Grosvenor Gallery. And you begin to see, after mid-century, that private galleries begin to actually make a difference. And the Impressionists, for example, in the 1870s, there are a lot of galleries that helped them out in Paris. So anyway, it was shown in a group exhibit there as The Woman in White. And it was, to Whistler's delight, it stole the show. And not because people thought it was beautiful or because they liked her dress, which Whistler designed, by the way, but because the picture, they was confounded. They didn't get it. As one critic reported, quote, despite the fact that she is remarkably strange and ugly, the woman in white is hung on the very best wall in the gallery. In all cases, those who approach her stop instantly, struck with amazement, and before looking at each other and bursting into fits of laughter. So, like, what is going on here? We have a young woman dressed in white. She's standing on a white bearskin rug in front of a white curtain. She's holding a lily, the well-known symbol of innocence and purity at that time. But then, what about the wilted flowers at her feet, they ask. In addition, there's her blank, stare, and her rather disheveled appearance. So critics offered endless interpretations. One said, she's clearly a fallen virgin. Another said, she's a deflowered bride the morning after a disappointing wedding night. And one said, she's the ghost of all fallen women. So initially, a number of critics suggested that Whistler's Mystery Lady was inspired by this immensely popular novel, which you might have heard of, by Wilkie Collins, a British novel, and it was titled Woman in White, which made Whistler so mad. I've never read that book. What are you talking about? But anyhow, in the end, in regard to trying to figure out the story, it seems that most observers agreed with one critic who wrote, quote, "It's obviously a story too hideous to tell." And to Whistler, it was all about the art, specifically about the challenge of capturing the subtleties of all these various combinations, various kinds of whites. He was shocked that nobody saw that was his challenge here, or that they appreciated what he thought was a masterful solution. And so he refused really to just leave it at that. So he adds to the title, Symphony and White. And he's going to do this now consistently. And he uses these musical titles, and I think it's a wonderful kind of way to think about art. The idea that music, which has no lyrics, is abstract, and you love it. It's beautiful. You enjoy it so much. And so he said, well, why does painting have to tell a story? So he sort of takes that as his life campaign. Anyway, hoping to underscore his intentions to make people look at this as an artwork, he retitles it then again Symphony and White. Now a footnote here is that Whistler spent months executing this portrait, working daily with white lead paint. And as a result of that prolonged exposure, he was really, really ill for weeks afterwards. It was what at that time they called painter's colic. Whistler's concerted effort to explore new interests, now that he's trying to shake off his realist experience. It appears again here in this work, which was done the following year, and it's called Symphony and White #2, and subtitled The Little White Girl. Now, by the way, it's the same dress that she wore in the previous painting, except that he has now had new sleeves attached. He loved designing dresses. When this work appeared in London's Royal Academy exhibit in 1864, one critic wrote, quote, "I am relieved that Mr. Whistler's second white girl lacks the mysterious morbidity of that first one." So let me point out a couple of things here, new pictorial elements that we have not seen, but you're going to see again. And one is the asymmetrical composition, very odd, and a very unconventional way in which he has chopped off her body, that's cropped in a way that you would not find anything like that in the Academy. And then we have these really unusual accessories. There's some cherry blossoms and the Japanese fan that she's holding, and some pieces of blue and white china. And isn't that a wonderful example showing his very soft and loose painting technique? That's why they called his painting of the piano smudgy. The Japanese theme, you saw those Japanese props in that last work. It takes, obviously, quite center stage. In this painting, it's called The Golden Screen, and this was also in 1864. And in it, you see Jo again. He's painted her hair dark to look like a Japanese woman, wearing a Japanese kimono in front of a Japanese screen. She's holding a Japanese print, and there's others strewn about the floor. There's other blue and white porcelain, lacquered box. All of these items were his, and they were part of his growing collection, new collection of Japanese prints and decorative objects. And in building that collection, he was very much a part of like a real craze at that time called Japanisme. This was a time when this was the first experience people had with things imported from Japan, which had only been open to trade with the West in the late 1850s. As he became more obsessed with Asian art, he became more and more insecure, cranky, dissatisfied, neurotic, and so forth about the direction of his painting. In 1867, he wrote to a friend in Paris, quote, "When will I have more knowledge? My work is so painful and uncertain, I produce very little because I rub it all out." At the same time he wrote, he so regretted his wasted time under Courbet's spell. He added to this in this letter, quote, "His damned realism has been the greatest misfortune for me." Unfortunately, his problems then was just not a fleeting crisis. From 1867 to 1870, he spent 3 years working harder than he ever worked in his life, and yet he did not complete a single large painting. And it was a bad time for him all around. He had a lot of financial problems. Obviously, he wasn't making any work. His mom came from America because of the Civil War. She's a big Confederate, and so she came to live with him in London. And he had a very, very painful breakup with Joe at this time. It kind of broke his heart. And it was really kind of ugly circumstances. He had been out of the country, so she went over to Paris and posed for Courbet in some very unladylike positions. And he suspected strongly that she had done other things in the nude as well, because these were nude pictures. So that was it. That was the end of that, and I think it hurt him a lot. But despite his problems now, things are really, really terrible. He never let on to anybody in London. He was strutting his stuff around town in his dandy outfit and the life of the party, still having champagne breakfast, which he gave often on Sundays, and he didn't have a dime to pay for anything. He charged his whole life. He owed people all over town. But his struggle to find his own aesthetic path became even more difficult when he had to face the fact that if he was going to survive financially, he had to get some portrait commissions. And that this was the first serious effort that he made to develop his portrait skills. And you've seen this before. This is arrangement in gray and black. And of course, when he finished this painting in 1871, I mean, could he ever have imagined that this would be the most well-known, frequently seen woman in history? Wait, except for the Virgin Mary. Mom would be number 2. That's a photo of Anna Matilda, actually, McNeill Whistler, and that was taken a few years earlier. She was a really classy Southern belle, quiet-mannered, but tough, and very religious. And when she came to live with Jimmy in 1863, I think it was, her presence had a very sobering effect on his household in more ways than one. And she adored him, and the feeling was mutual. And I have to ask you, does anybody here know about these hats? Because, you know, I've done a lot of work in 19th century photography, and time and again, I run across, like, 1850s, 60s, women have these hats. And it's like getting your art card, I think, because I'm wondering at what age do you open the box and say, oh my God, it's a hat, you know? But seriously, older women all have these little hats with like the little ears. So the story goes here that one day in the spring of 1871, I mean, he has made up his mind that he's going to have to be a portrait artist one way or another. He was having a meltdown because which he had quite often, but the model he had hired did not show up. And so Mom was so worried that he was having such a hissy that she said, okay, I'll sit for you, never mind, is that okay? So initially, at his request, she posed standing, and after a couple of days in a standing position, she said something like, forget it, Jimmy, get me a chair and a footstool, or we're done here. So it took 3 months of nearly daily sittings over the summer of 1871 to complete the portrait. And once again, as with his white girl painting, he purposely assigned the title Arrangement in Grain Black. And that was to underscore that what he was interested in here was not the likeness, that was secondary to his concern, the kind of challenge that he felt in trying to make a beautiful arrangement of shapes and harmonies in using the fewest amount of shapes and with a very nearly monochromatic palette. And I don't know if you probably didn't notice, but the print on the wall is his Black Lion Wharf print. That I had showed you. He loved that print. And I thought it was interesting too because the idea of showing her in profile, I had never really thought much about that, but it was a very clever way to put her appearance secondary. You rarely ever see a profile portrait at this time unless it has a kind of naturally ethereal quality. So if you want a really romantic, like a wistful look, you might put someone, you might just show their profile. I think he used this because it gives the least amount of information about what a person looks like. And so that, so it's part of his sort of overall plan to emphasize what he sees as the beauty of the arrangement in the pictorial elements. Whistler, so he, of course, is eager to get this into the Royal Academy because his hope for this portrait is that it's going to be like an advertisement to get some interest in hiring him or giving him commissions for portraits. So she went public in 1872 when the painting was shown in the Royal Academy exhibit. And I loved this tale that a man came up to him at the opening of the show and he said, Mr. Whistler, I really like the way you painted your mother. And Whistler said, well, yes, one does like to make one's mummy as pretty as possible. The most frequent response, however, from people was like indignation. They were shocked. First, he didn't even have her name. He calls this Arrangement in Grain Black. But it was, how could anybody paint their own mother, their own dear mother, in such a cold, dispassionate manner? I mean, the guy has no family values. And he loved that because he despised the overly pious, the sanctity and Victorian ideas of motherhood and so on and so forth. But apparently the Royal Academy judges had been similarly appalled. In fact, they were so appalled that when it was reviewed, they had voted to reject it. Whistler was only spared that embarrassment because there was, I think in the voting, there was a hanging chad. I had to say, I'm in Florida, anyway, the only way he was saved from that fate was because a very important, very senior member of the Academy jury, Sir Boxall, said, it's fine, if you don't put Mom in the show, I'm resigning. And so everyone was horrified and shocked. And so they did actually then obviously accept her. And despite the fact that the jury was sworn to secrecy, of course, like Congress, Whistler soon got wind of what had gone down, and he was livid. He was so angry. He said, "I'm done with them, that's it." And he stuck to his word, and he never again submitted the work to the Royal Academy. And that was a tough thing at that time. So, as I said, he had hoped that this would be a work that would open a new avenue of business for him. And as it turned out, his first paying customer occupied not a high social position, but rather a position of respect throughout the British Isles as one of the most important philosophers and historians and writers at the time. His name is Thomas Carlile. He came to Whistler. He loved the portrait of his mother. He'd been painted by every important artist in the British Isles, and he never liked any of the paintings. So it was a coup. And so because he had been so impressed with the portrait of his mom, Jimmy just clearly thought, I'm gonna not risk anything. I'm gonna stick close to the model. So you can see. And as a result, however, Carlyle's portrait came to be titled An Arrangement in Gray and Black, #2. Given the personalities involved here, it is a miracle that this portrait ever occurred. Carlile was every bit as irascible and crazy and eccentric as the painter. And then Whistler's working methods were just really not sympathetic at all to his sitters. He painted alla prima, which means he did not use any kind of preparatory sketches. He would just simply work with a big brush and lay everything in that way, just go right at it. And lots of times, he had to start over. And he felt compelled to cover the entire canvas, and these are almost life-size, in one sitting. Every sitting had to completely cover the canvas. During their months and months and months of sittings, much to Carlyle's amazement, Whistler scraped off the entire picture at least 10 times. And this really was not atypical for him. And that's, you can see, that he really got a really good likeness, I think. The story goes that Carlile was finally at his wit's end. This is never going to end. And one day he said, "Whistler, Jimmy, we're going to move this thing along. Can you buy some bigger brushes?" Great. Anyway, when it was over, Carlile, everyone thought that it was very successful, that it was a wonderful likeness. And actually, even Carlile was pleased with it. And when it was all over, he said, "I love the portrait, but," quote, "that Mr. Whistler is the most absurd creature on the face of the earth." And I don't have enough time. I took all my little notes out about this because it's so beautiful. I had to bring it along. And he did begin to get some wealthy patrons, like a banker, Mr. Alexander, who hires him to paint his daughters. And this is the little Cecily Alexander. And it's considered, and I certainly agree, to be one of the finest portraits of the 19th century. And I'd love to tell you, he was just so difficult. He told her mother, "All right, I'll do the portrait, but this is what her dress is going to look like, and here's where you go to get the organza, and don't put bluing on it, but starch it and iron it just so." That was what he did to his portrait subjects. By the way, he's feeling better these days. This is in the early 1870s now. That was an 1873 portrait. For one reason, because his mood has improved, because he has a new mistress. And there's James in his studio, and that's a picture of Maud Franklin, and that's the woman he was with for about 15 years. Had a couple of children by, he's got kids everywhere. No one has ever been able to list them all or to locate him. But this becomes his signature style, these full-length, tall, narrow portraits where the body really fills the frame and it has such a presence because of that. Now, by 1873, this kind of standing pose with very few accessories, as I said, becomes his hallmark style. If you notice back there, he worked these really long brushes. He hardly ever got close to the canvas. In fact, his mother told the stories that he always stood way back from the canvas, and then he would just stand back and go, "Oh my God! Oh, it's ruined!" And then he would run up and make a little, and then he'd run over and hug her and say, "Oh, you're beautiful! It's beautiful!" So I guess he was quite a show all the way around. But anyway, he does begin to have some success in this new sub category of his work. But I wanted you to meet this man, Frederick Leyland, who sometimes we described as the Victorian Medici, so not bad to have a friend like that. He was extremely wealthy, and he was really a dedicated and he was very liberal in his thinking and very supportive of new ideas. He was also really cultured, like a concert level pianist, and anyway, he was a great connection for Whistler. And Whistler's first association with him came when he became a consultant for Leyland in collecting, Asian art, his Japanese and whatever. They became best friends. Whistler was with him a lot, ate dinner with him, went to the concert with him. And when Leyland was out of town, he even became the stand-in kind of escort for Mrs. Leyland. And this is Mrs. Leyland. And she said, "James, I'm going to be wearing black since Fred wore black in his portrait." And he had a fit. And she then, of course, listened to him. He designed the gown, he got the fabric, everything. He wants to work in this very narrow range of color. It's all about the color harmonies and the subtleties. It's Frances Leyland. And there were rumors about that he liked her more than he should have. He loved redheads, for one thing. But anyway, what happens then, unfortunately, is after like 7 years, they practically supported him. They really were his principal patrons. But unfortunately, this really great relationship for him ended very abruptly in an event that became the talk of London in 1876. And it was this event that has caused scholars to say he is the aesthetic kamikaze. And the whole thing begins with this painting that Whistler had done actually back in 1863 when he was in his really Japanese mode. He did it as a portrait, and the father came to see it and said, what is she going to a Halloween party? What's the deal with this garb? And he wouldn't buy it. So it turned out to not be a good surprise. But a few years later, Leyland bought the portrait to hang in the dining room of his London mansion. And with Whistler's help, Leyland had amassed this huge portrait of collection of blue and white china or porcelain. And when he decided to make his dining room the showcase for that collection, Leyland hired, his name was Thomas Jekyll. He was the most noted and expensive interior designer in the British Isles. He hired him to redo this room so he would make it into this wonderful display environment. Under Jekyll's directions, the walls were covered in ochre-colored leather. Now, there are no photographs that I think that they'll ever know what the room looked like initially. But anyway, he hired him, and this was his plan. He covered the walls, as I said, in this ochre-colored leather. that had some little reddish flowers on it. And it was not just any leather, it was an antique leather that he had brought to England for Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine. So then Jekyll designed this network of lacy shelves that went on the wall to hold the porcelain. And Leyland was such a happy man. He thought it was absolutely wonderful. When Whistler came to hang the portrait, he said, "Oh, you know, the colors in this portrait don't really complement this new decor the way they should. Maybe I could just touch up the leather, those little red flowers, just tone them down just a little bit." And it was no big deal, really. And so Leyland says, "Well, you know, of course, I'll defer to you." And Jekyll said, "Well, it sounds minimal." Okay. So Leyland goes off out of the country, and Jekyll goes back to his next project. And Whistler touches up the walls, and it looks horrible. You know, oh my gosh, this is worse than, oh dear, what do I do now? Well, he decides to fix it, and it's an understatement to say that he got carried away. In the following weeks, in the fall of 1876 and the winter of 1877, he totally transforms this room, working many days until midnight. And he applied thick coats of blue-green paint over all of the leather walls to resemble a Japanese enamel. And then he paints all of the woodwork, you can see gold. And then on the walls he paints these large gold, silver, and platinum leaf peacocks. And he covers the entire ceiling with gold peacock eyes. And as he painted away, the event became a circus. His friends stopped by, the press heard about it, they came by, then the public started just stopping in, and he loved it. And he's on the ladder at the top. He starts serving tea, he starts serving brandy, and it was a circus. And I mean, it was, again, it was like became this huge kind of source of entertainment. Mrs. Leyland, I don't know, she was out of the country too, I guess, because she never heard about it either. And the story goes, and this is probably just art history rumor, but Jekyll stops by, he had not seen it, and he was speechless. And he left immediately and had a nervous breakdown. And they told Whistler, and Whistler said, "Yes, I do have that effect on some people." This is in 1876, and this is Art Nouveau, which does not come in until 1880s and 90s in Paris. I mean, he was so ahead of his time in so many areas that it's unbelievable. Well, Leland returns and is stunned and explodes, and he tells Whistler, quote, "You have degenerated into nothing but an artistic Barnum. And if you ever step foot in my house again, I'm going to have you horsewhipped." That was before Whistler gave him a bill for $200,000. I mean, 2,000 guineas, which in today's it would be $200,000. Oh my gosh. And for some reason, eventually, Leyland paid him, but he didn't pay him the full amount. He paid him maybe half. But he really annoyed and infuriated Whistler because he paid Whistler not in guineas, but in pounds. And I didn't know this, but at this time, I guess traditionally or historically, professionals were paid with guineas and workmen were paid with pounds. So it was like a huge insult to him. He gets back in the house when the Leylands are away and paints on the end wall these two squabbling peacocks. The one on the left with money flying everywhere, and the other one is a poor peacock with a paintbrush. And then he goes around and he puts his little monogram. Oh, I didn't show you that he has it. He comes with this butterfly monogram. So he puts it in numerous places around the room. So the Peacock and Firestorm made Whistler's, he made him the most, he already was sort of, but the most famous or infamous artist in England. And unfortunately, that would not be the last time that he became the talk of the city. And to tell that story, I had to back up a little bit in time, because I have to show you how Whistler's art, the way he pictured the Thames, how he outgrew realism. And because this next event is related to his landscape. By the spring of 1863, so we're going back here in time, Whistler moved. He was so thrilled. He moved to Chelsea, down near the old Battersea Bridge. And he could see, he was on the water, he could see right across to the Battersea shore, the old industrial area there. And this, he could see this really from standing on his porch from his window. Now the boats here in the foreground are part, it's a Greaves family boatyard, and I'm just pointing it out because I'm going to mention that a little bit later. And he loved living on the water. He loved he was fascinated by the kind of complexity, the variety of shapes in the watercraft. And typically, because this was a working river, I mean, he loved the challenge of like pulling out a coherent, simpler design out of that kind of the chaos of it all. If he looked a little farther left to the west, he could see the old bridge. This is the old Battersea Bridge. It was the only wooden bridge left in England. And this was, he began to work in these sort of muted tones more and more at this time. Do you remember, it's been a few years ago, that there was a whale that went up, remember? Yeah. That went up the Thames, and that whale was right there. And it was stopped around the Battersea, the Battersea Bridge. By the end of the 60s, when Whistler was in the depth of that stylistic crisis that I told you about, it finally occurred to him that over time, what had come to really fascinate him most about the river were the dramatic changes that he observed in the water and in the bridges and in the boats, the shorelines, when they were obscured by haze or darkness. And he referred to this as the mystery of the Thames. And what he saw in studying these atmospheric conditions at dawn, dusk, and the dark or whatever, he saw there the degree of simplicity and the kind of subtleties of tone that he so wanted to be able to get in his painting but never had. And so these ideas inspired a completely unorthodox approach to picturing the Thames that he began in 1870. And it's exemplified here, and now this is the same view that's the one we just saw, the Battersea Reach, that not the bridge one, but the image before. And this image pleased him immensely. And he called these, for the first year or so, he called these atmospheric scenes moonlights. Until his friend, at that time, we're going back here, Frederick Leyland, said, "Why don't you call them nocturnes?" Leyland loved Chopin's Nocturne. He said, "You use musical nomenclature anyway, and this works with your arrangements." He was also doing works at this time he called harmonies. So I'm going to show you just a few of these. This is now, we call these his Nocturne. And he was so thrilled with the idea of that term that he later told Leyland, he said, "I can't thank you enough for that suggestion about the Nocturne. You have no idea how it irritates the critics, and that really gives me a good feeling." I love it, he said. So I'll show you a few others here. This is the entrance to Southampton Water. It's called Nocturne in Blue and Gold. And the one that you just saw is Nocturne in Blue and Silver, the Battersea Reach. And then this one, whoops, sorry, line here, yeah. This is the Southampton Harbor, the water. This is up in the an inlet in the English Channel. Now, what I want you to know here is that he's not just making these up. These are not figments of his imagination, but they are works that he arrived at by actually going on site. And I'm trying to find the key here to this other picture I want to get. Anyway, let me just show you a couple of others here. Right, this is called Nocturne in Blue and Silver, the Thames in Moonlight. Now, this is another observation. Let me go back to this one just for a second. Here's how he did these. He would do the preparatory work for these views. Luckily, he had a little help. Remember the Greaves boatyard? Well, in that early Battersea view that was right across the street from his house. In exchange for drawing classes or lessons from their sons, the Greaves family furnished him a boat and had one of the kids be his oarsman, and they would row him around from dusk until dawn on many, many frequent occasions. So when that was happening, when he was in the boat, he would spend the night scribbling and sketching, and the boy said that sometimes he would just have them stop and he would stare for hours at a portion of the shoreline. And what he was trying to do was to get in his head so he could sort of commit to memory the experience of the atmosphere, and then he would use his sketches and his memories to recreate these images in the studio. I also just brought along a couple of views of Japanese prints, the kind that he was collecting. And I thought it was more than a coincidence that it was very much in the tradition of these Japanese scenic prints at this time to use only two colors. The whole image would be created with two colors, and I thought just to show you as examples. And his works were all also based on various mixtures of only two colors. And he would make all of these different mixtures with more blue and more silver and so forth. And he called them his sauces, and he would mix those up before he ever started painting. These are small paintings, by the way. They're no more than 30 inches. Most of them are like 26 inches, 20 inch by 20 inches high. And this is an area, now they would have had to row for 3 miles up the river to get to the Westminster. This is a Westminster Bridge. And here you see another view in the Westminster area. This is called Nocturne in Grey and Gold, the Westminster Palace. This is actually the Houses of Parliament. At that time they called it Westminster Palace. This is the most well-known of his series, and probably the last that he made. It was in 1878. It's called Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. And this is a treasure of the Detroit Art Institute. And it pictures the fireworks at Cremorne Gardens, which is on the water, just not far from Chelsea. They had nightly fireworks displays there. And this is a work that's probably the closest to abstraction, although he's pretty close in some other works as well. On the left is a looming large tree, that dark shape, and then the fireworks you can see is there in the center. And the grays and blues are we assume, kind of smoke. In 1877, when a few liberal patrons are actually beginning to show interest in buying some of his nocturnes, Whistler displayed several of them, including this one, in a show at the Grosvenor Gallery. And the show attracted a whole lot of attention, especially after it was critiqued by this man, John Ruskin. For much of the Victorian period, Ruskin was the hope of British art criticism, and he was a guy you didn't want to mess with. He was Oxford Distinguished Professor, he had all kinds of books. He was the man who made J.M.W. Turner famous, put him on the map. But after he was finished with his work on Turner, he turned to a new interest. He became messianic about the fact that art had to serve a high moral purpose. And this was really his campaign. So coming from that perspective, here's what he had to say about Whistler and his falling rocket painting. He said, quote, "I am dismayed that the painting was even admitted to the gallery. I have seen much of Cockney impudence before, but I never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face." Well, Whistler was beyond incensed and immediately sued for libel, asking for £1,000 plus costs. He waited 16 months because Ruskin was having ongoing health problems. And he did. I mean, Ruskin had really lots of problems. His health problems at that time related to nervous breakdowns that he had. He had fallen in love with a 9-year-old girl. Just a little artistry gossip here. He loved her so much that he agreed to wait until she was 18. And so he waits, for 9 years and then proposes to her, and she says, "Are you kidding?" So he had a total nervous breakdown. And then she died shortly before, unexpectedly. She was like only in her 20s or 30s, maybe she was 30. But anyway, it just totally destroyed him. And earlier than that, back in *54, he had a difficulty. This is a painting by John Everett Millais, the pre-Raphaelite artist. And Millais and Ruskin's younger wife got together. And so Millais says, "Oh my gosh, what are we going to do, if we're falling in love?" Because he was doing the painting of Ruskin, and they spent a lot of time together. And then she said, "Well, don't worry about it. I'm still a virgin." And they had been married for 7 years. And so there was this big public thing, the annulment. So I mean, Ruskin was kind of just hanging on by a thread these days anyway. So finally, after 16 months, Whistler decides that he will agree to go ahead with the trial without Ruskin. And so the trial proceeded finally in November of 1878 in a standing room only courtroom, and it was the social event of the season, as you can imagine. After two of his artist friends gave the most lame testimonies in his defense you can imagine, Whistler was called to the box to answer questions about the falling rocket. So this is Ruskin's lawyer. He says, "Mr. Whistler, will you describe this nocturne?" Now, when he was saying that, they were holding the painting up to the jury upside down. So he asked him, "Will you please describe this nocturne?" Whistler, "It is a night piece representing the fireworks at Cremorne Gardens." Ruskin, "So you're saying that it's not a view of Cremorne?" Whistler, "It is not called a view, it is called a nocturne, which is an artistic arrangement of line, form, and color first." The lawyer says, "Well, could you explain the beauty in this picture?" Whistler said, "No, it is impossible for me to explain the beauty of this picture, just as it would be impossible for a musician to explain to you the beauty of a piece of music if you have no ear for music." So the next exchange was over about this other, this is the Nocturne in Blue and Gold, Old Battersea Bridge. It's in the Tate in London. The lawyer says to Whistler, "Do you say that this is a correct representation of Battersea Bridge?" Whistler, "I did not intend it to be a correct portrait of the bridge. And as for what the picture represents, that depends on who looks at it. My whole scheme was only to bring about a certain harmony of color. So the jury was out 1 hour before reaching a verdict. The jury gave their verdict to Whistler, but awarded him damages of 1 farthing, which is 1/4 penny. Whistler had sued for, £1,000. In addition, the judge awarded the judgment to Whistler without cost. Nevertheless, Whistler celebrated it as a victory and wore the farthing on his watch fob for the rest of his life. But you could read his notions of the trial, and he wrote a book called The Gentle Art of Making Enemies, published in 1890. Anyhow, together, the court costs, the legal fee, and more than a year of lost sales totally ruined Whistler financially. In addition, Maud was having a baby at this time as well. That's his mistress. A few months later, owing everybody in London, Whistler declares bankruptcy. And naturally, he went out in style by throwing a champagne breakfast when the bailiffs were coming and taking the things out of his house, and he lost everything. His beloved porcelain, his a new house that he had just gotten, the very first house, and one writer at the time said this about it: Whistler's falling rocket took him down with it, and it really was the case. And I'm just going to sort of close there, except to tell you that he does come back. He financially, what happens immediately is in 1879, he has a commission to do a set of etchings from Venice. And so he and Maud go to Venice, and it was going to be a 3-month job, and he stretched it to, he didn't come back for 14 months. But he did pastels, he did amazing prints, he did lithographs. Here's a nocturne that he does of the lagoon in Venice. And when he comes back with these, in 1880, they have a big show, and they are a smashing success. And he begins to recover financially. In fact, he said, the pastels are selling, and I thought they were good. So through the 80s and 90s, I mean, he just continues to rise in regard to his reputation. And also, he has in 1880, he has the famous, or 85, his 10 o'clock lecture, which was amazing. He actually just formulates the whole idea of art for art's sake, which is what all of this has been about. That art should answer no other outside story or message or whatever. It's about the beauty of the formal elements of the painting. And of course, I mean, he's so ahead of his time there, because that's really the whole sort of basis, the theory for modern art. But he does get married finally, and he marries in 1886 a woman named Beatrix Godwin. Her husband was a famous, well-known architect there. And here she is. She was half his age and twice his weight, which everyone thought that was interesting. But anyway, he was so happy with Trixie, as he called her. And they did quite well financially. In 1890, the French government bought his portrait of his mother and conferred the Legion of Honor on him. The city of Glasgow bought his portrait of Carlile. And so, I mean, really, all kinds of wonderful things happened, except that she only lived about 5 or 6 years. And when she died of cancer, he really never came back from that. And there's his last self-portrait. I wanted to tell you about the Peacock Room. You probably know this, but he actually called it, the harmony in blue and gold. And when Leyland died, and for whatever reason, Leyland never touched it. When he died in 1904, I think it was, an American industrialist, Charles Freer, who had been collecting Whistler works, went to London, he bought that room, and they took it piece by piece back, put it together in his Detroit home, and then before he died, I think it was maybe like 1919 or whatever, he established the Freer Museum in the Smithsonian, and the Peacock Room is there, and it's fabulous, along with 30,000 pieces of ancient art that he had also collected, and all kinds of wonderful Whistler works and memorabilia. So just to conclude, he's just amazing that he was so out there and so far in advance of his time, and that he managed to make such a difference. He had no followers really, and he wouldn't get involved with the Impressionists. He really didn't ever want to follow anybody else in terms of giving up his own, very unique aesthetic challenges. So thank you so much. And let me just say something off the wall, art and popular culture. And I'm going to talk about the Mona Lisa, the Scream, the Kiss, and American Gothic, and talk about why they are such iconic images and the story behind them and the artists. So there'll be 4 lectures. And if you fell asleep tonight, you didn't come and give me another chance at 100.